Okay, so this lecture reading is divided into two parts for the class. And for the first lecture on this topic, it covers kind of the initial time frame. So the reading is kind of divided in half. So in a period of time, we kind of come back to this reading to pick up the second half from the 1930s up into the contemporary period. And this is sort of the early period. And what I want you guys to focus on is the way the reading's divided up. There are subchapters for school access, quality of education, curriculum policies, and patterns of school performance. And each one of those areas has some specific issues that are relevant. Some other things, secondary things, would be the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the rights that were secured under it, the difference between additive and subtractive Americanization. And then we'll use some examples of those with Catholic schools, Protestant schools, and public schools. So I always like to mention with this topic, we're talking about Hispanics in the Southwest. The difference between the term Latino, Latina, and Hispanic is that if you look at Latin America or anything south of the United States, basically, Latino is a general term that covers people within those countries, Central and South America. Hispanic tends to be more specific to places that were colonized by Spain and speak kind of traditional Castilian Spanish. So Brazil, for example, where Portuguese is the language, would be Latino, but not Hispanic. Mexican American would be, or Mexico would be basically Latino, but also Hispanic. And then Chicano was a term that sought solidarity with both people in that, who through came through colonization, but also those who were born there, part of the indigenous population. All right. And there's a video on this topic with the difference between Latino and Hispanic, or you can look up the information. I just think it's helpful to kind of know and important. And then two, I think it's something where people kind of determine for themselves. So if they're in the United States, but they trace their roots back to Central or South America, then they can generally make the determination whether they prefer Latino or Hispanic. And I have tended to find you'll find regional differences in different parts of the United States. So I always like to mention I did my undergrad in New Mexico, in Las Cruces. There's a picture of it. This is a picture of what's called Old Town Mesilla, which is a traditional southwestern style town. There's the old kind of western boardwalks with the posts where you would tie your horse up. Old Town Mesilla was where Billy the Kid was jailed, and he shimmied out of jail and escaped and shot Pat Garrett outside of town. So there's a tremendous amount of sort of old western history here. I always like to mention one of the teachers I worked with owned a bar at the other end of the little square there opposite the church. And then the reason I like to mention it is because in the center here there's a gazebo, and that's where the Gadsden Purchase was signed. And the Gadsden Purchase basically readjusted the border from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So it was something that that I saw quite a lot living there. And there was actually places that I visited in Mexico where you could see the old border versus the new border. But what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did was it brought an end to the Mexican-American War that we'd been fighting. We drove Mexican troops back to Mexico City, and as a negotiated outcome of that war, we redrew the boundaries of the United States significantly. We annexed a huge portion of land that today would include California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. And so if any of you drove through this area, it's a huge swath of land. It's a large area. And of course the names there, whether it's Albuquerque in New Mexico or Los Angeles, San Bernardino in California, the remnants of the Mexican influence and culture in that area is there if you're familiar with it or if you've been there. So those roots go back, and I always like to mention that I have friends, for example, in New Mexico who trace their family lineage back to like the 1600s. So long before my family immigrated to the United States, there's a history and kind of family ties to the land that go back there. And so what the United States did was, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they sought to retain people in that region. And I really like to mention this or lean on this a little bit in class, because I think there's a huge difference as a teacher whether or not you look at Latinos and Hispanics in the United States. You look at that culture as something that's just a part of the United States, that it's been here, um, that it's connected to our country and our history, versus looking at it as something foreign, something invasive, something kind of alien. And obviously, the preference, or what I would hope you would take from this, is to look at it as Hispanic culture is connected to the United States, something that's been a part of our country for a long time. And this was just contemporary issues. This was the when people were talking about Mexico paying to build the border wall, this was circulating on social media, and it was kind of like Mexico would agree to pay the border wall, but they would agree to the 1948 border. So this is what the United States would kind of look like, had we not annexed that huge area of land. And so on this slide, there's basically the outcome, which I've already sort of covered, that it brought an end to the Mexican-American War, and we annexed a huge swath of land following that time period. And as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what the United States did was they granted to people in this region property rights, three rights that I want you to remember that are important: property rights, the rights to retain the use of the Spanish language, and the rights of American citizens. Now, one of the things that the authors get into in the piece we read is that even though these were agreed to initially when the treaty was signed, we didn't always seek to uphold our end of the bargain. There were efforts made to seize property, and obviously, in the point we'll get to, the use of Spanish language in schools is something that's been under attack for a long period of time. And a lot of these issues, as a side note too, we'll come back to in when we come back to the second part of the reading. So I like to emphasize the authors use the term additive versus subtractive Americanization. These terms get used a lot in bilingual education as well. And I think that in both cases, bilingual education, the outcome that people want is for students to become fluent in English. In Americanization, people want to help people acclimate to American culture and society. I think the difference is, with additive, it's the idea of retaining. So in bilingual education, that would be retaining the use of Spanish along with English. In the context of Americanization, it would be retaining elements of the original culture along with Americanization. So it's the idea that the additive is the idea that you can coexist peacefully. Subtractive would be the idea of removing the native culture, removing the native language, in order to become, seemingly more proficient in the transition. I will say with bilingual education, for example, that the research tends to show that it's more effective, especially for older students, if they retain their natural language, because then you retain all the concepts and information you had, and it takes a little more time, but then to build English as kind of a to be genuinely bilingual, to speak both languages. And in Americanization, what we'll see are a number of examples through the reading where the additive approach tended to be more effective. And I always reference a book that was written here by Angela Venezuela, which was based on a 3-year ethnographic study, and it's a really good book on additive versus subtractive acculturation. So the authors of the piece we read used what they call the plight dimension and the struggle dimension. The plight being what Mexican Americans faced, and then the struggle dimension, how they reacted and responded to it. We'll cover both of those domains in the reading. So the 3 examples are given: Catholic schools, Protestant, and public. Catholic early on, well, throughout their existence, basically in the Southwest, Catholic schools viewed Hispanic culture as coexisting peacefully with the church. There's been a long history of the Catholic Church in Central South America. And so they took a more additive approach, and as a result, were supported by the community and tended to be more effective. Protestant schools had the opposite approach. They tended to view Hispanic culture as not aligning with the church, and so the schools, Protestant schools, tended to be to take on a kind of paternalistic view of kids, like a kind of parent, as seeing them in need of help, but a more subtractive approach, and they were ineffective and generally resisted by the community. Public schools started off additive, as early on there was more local control, and so they had more of a positive orientation. But over time, as population increased in those areas, school enrollment increased, things like that, public schools became subtractive in their approach. And I would say, as a whole, this is a generalization, but as a whole, public schools have tended to take a more subtractive approach to acculturation, language, things like that, through this region through the 20th century. And the authors cover a lot of these examples. So one of the things in class that I connect this topic to, and that I try to often have a discussion around, and to bring things into a contemporary period in terms of the tension that sort of exists in this area, is I've used more recently DACA, and that's been playing out in the media or playing out in the courts and in real life, but covered by the media over the last few years. And I'm not going to take the time to explain it now, but I have posted a video explaining DACA, and um, how it affects teachers and students and individuals in the United States. It's a very good research paper topic if you're ever interested in learning more. Um, and generally, too, what I've discussed with that is there's been a number of people who've suggested that schools be responsible for reporting students that they think are in the country illegally. And one of the examples that I always like to give here um, is with a doctor. You know, doctors sometimes are forced to care for people who maybe have done terrible things, or committed crimes, or so, in a sense, like, that's it's an extreme example, and I'm not comparing the two. But with a doctor, for example, just because they treat somebody who may have done something bad and been wounded in the act or something, doesn't mean they condone the act, and doesn't mean they um, there's a professional ethic there as a doctor that would cause you to do that. And even though immigration is a very different topic, but I do understand it's a complicated issue and there are different perspectives on it. The comparison that I would make here is that teachers, too, I believe, have a kind of professional ethic to support students, regardless of their immigration background. And I always like to point out here that the Supreme Court has ruled on this issue as well. And the case here is Plier v. Doe. And in the past, when schools have tried to exclude or charge immigrant students fund or money to attend school, things like that, the Supreme Court has ruled that basically public schools have an ethical obligation to take care of or to provide an education for the students in that community. And that's been the position of the court. And as a side note, when it comes to, voting, current elections, and there have been over recent years some appointments to the Supreme Court. And the one case, it's one that doesn't get talked about publicly, but Plier v. Doe is one of the cases that always come to mind for me in that context. And an example would be when Justice Kennedy retired recently, and the reappointment. Um, so far, connecting it back to DACA, the Supreme Court did rule in a 5-4 decision recently that that the president's attempt to remove DACA and get rid of DACA was unconstitutional. And so, the context of that might have been more constitutional and legal, but at least it indicates to me that there's probably not a strong motivation to overturn Plier v. Doe at this time. But if the court were to change more in the coming years, I think then that would um, that could potentially be at risk. Um, so public schools are talked about in the piece. Again, that kind of paternalistic, taking a kind of paternalistic approach, viewing Mexican Americans as in need of saving from their own culture, things like that. And then the viewing Mexican American students as a labor source through the 20th century. And that's something that we'll come back to when we come back to the latter part of the reading. So school access, I'm just going to go through these different areas. Um, Let me see, I have them listed here. So I'm going to go through all four of these and try to hit a few key points that I want you to know. And again, you can look them up. I think they're pretty easy to follow in the reading. But with school access, there's an increase in school enrollment for a number of reasons: immigration, urbanization, students moving into one area, um, child labor laws, restricting child labor, things like that, all lead to an increase in school access and enrollment in public schools. But what you begin to see is a growing gap between Anglo students and Mexican American students. Another key point here is that the author points out that even though school access increased over time, three groups of students were traditionally excluded. Those will be agricultural migrants. Um, I give the example here. In class, I often point to there's about 20,000 migrant families that come through Indiana each year. Migrant agricultural migrants are individuals generally from Mexico or from Central America who follow the harvest periods. So in the South, some crops might be harvested earlier, so they will live there for a period of time and then move north as crops come into to be harvested. And so that group has been excluded, and that's an ongoing challenge in Indiana to provide educational opportunity for the children of those people. The other groups would be secondary students, high school, limited high school access, and then post secondary, so college. And these are issues that we'll talk about as well in both when we come back to this reading, but also with Brown versus Board of Education in a period of time when we get to that reading. Quality of education. This is the growth of segregated schooling. So schools become more segregated, and then as well the passage of English only laws. And here, what I want you to remember is that those English only laws were challenged by Mexican American parents, and that those laws were overturned by the Supreme Court. The United States, unlike some countries, we don't have an official national language on our laws. Obviously, English is, the language that kind of has become the, our national language sort of informally, but anyway, so yeah, those laws were overturned. Curriculum policies here, I want you to remember that there was a major shift from what the author calls the three R's to the three C's. So the three R's are used all the time to refer to reading, writing, arithmetic, and so to what he calls the three C's, which are the civics instruction, cultural norms, and command of the English language. Now, the important point that I want you to remember, you don't have to memorize those exact terms, but remember that it shifted from an academic curriculum to a subtractive kind of socialization curriculum. So from an academic curriculum to a curriculum based on socialization and a subtractive one. Um, and there were gaps here too as well in terms of um, access to proper resources. In patterns of school performance, you see major gaps in terms of low test scores among Mexican Americans, um, low graduation rates or high withdrawal rates, and low performance. Now, the one thing that I want to emphasize here, though, is that the author also points out and major gaps that sort of remain consistent between Mexican students and Anglo students. So major gaps in performance that exist over the 20th century. The author does point out, however, that it wasn't all bad performance, that even against great odds, a number of Mexican American students, we don't have a ton of data on it, but we do know that a number were successful and did persevere in school. All right, and then when we come back to this topic, we'll talk about that issue of dropout rates, and I'll try to give some specific examples there, and we'll delve into that a little more in depth. And then I also like to cover what the research tells us about how we can prevent students from leaving school early, dropping out, which begins as early as elementary, really becomes important in middle school, and then remains an issue throughout secondary education or in high school. And also here in class, I show a video. This relates to a program in New Mexico where students who have been deported, who are American citizens. They were born here, so they have citizenship, but their parents were deported. There are now colonies of these students who are living in Mexico, and there's some programs now in New Mexico where the students brought over. So they live in Mexico, but they receive an education in the United States, and they kind of take a bus back and forth across the border each day. And I find it a very interesting program, something that's kind of popped up recently with yeah, I don't know. We could say more increased deportations, but definitely more kind of random or going after a broader scope of people in terms of deportation. So, all right. Hope this is helpful, and if you have any questions about it, please email me.